We're moving in a younger direction, he said, his voice as cold as brushed steel while sliding the termination papers across the polished oak desk. We need new energy. I sat there, still wearing the same worn-out suit that had seen me through hundreds of meetings, staring at the words on the page like they were written in some foreign tongue. No one ever tells you that being let go comes right after finishing your first round of treatment for early-stage pancreatic cancer. No one warns you that after 9 years of carrying nearly 40% of your company's revenue, you'll be summoned into a glass-walled conference room not to be thanked, not to be honored, but simply to hear, "You've been great, but we're done here." My name is Thomas Rourke, 52 years old, former senior client executive at Harlan Brayton, a mid-sized financial firm based in Columbus, Ohio. I never chased big titles. I just did the work, put 3 kids through college, and built trust with every client whose signature I earned on nothing but my word. I didn't have an MBA, wasn't flashy, but my clients called me on Christmas, and I remembered their dog's name. 6 months ago, I was diagnosed with early-stage pancreatic cancer. Still treatable, the doctor said, if I committed to it early. I didn't quit. I simply asked to work remote 2 days a week during chemo. No one objected, but no one asked how I was doing either. Then, last week, they moved my desk next to the supply closet. A new hire half my age was suddenly shadowing me at client meetings I'd built over 7 years. I said nothing. I told myself it was just coincidence. But today made everything clear. They didn't need me anymore. Not because I failed, but because I no longer fit their picture of the future. The Monday I got the call, I'd just finished a chemo session, still wearing the hospital wristband under my shirt cuff. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear or emotion, but from the lingering effects of the drugs. But I made my way into the office anyway, telling myself I was still needed, still part of something. There was a meeting invite on my calendar, leadership alignment review. It said vague and sterile, but I knew better. When I stepped into the conference room, Brian Kessler was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by 2 HR reps I barely recognized. They didn't even look up when I walked in. Brian gestured to the chair across from him with that same rehearsed calm he used when telling interns to tighten their slide decks. I sat not because I was ready, but because standing felt like resistance, and I wasn't sure if I had the energy for resistance anymore. He cleared his throat and began with a phrase I'd come to dread in recent months. "This isn't personal, Tom." From that moment, the words poured out of him like a script rehearsed a dozen times. "You've been an asset," he said, "but the company's evolving, and we need people who can adapt quickly to new expectations, higher demands, faster turnarounds. You've had a great run." I watched his mouth move, but my mind kept drifting to my daughter's graduation last spring, to the night I first told my wife about the diagnosis, to the long, quiet drives home from chemo when I'd remind myself I was still useful, still contributing. He slid a manila envelope across the table, the kind that usually held contracts I spent my life building. This time it held the terms of my exit. I nodded slowly, though I wasn't sure whether it was out of understanding or disbelief. No questions were asked about my health, no acknowledgement of the missed holidays, the red-eye flights, or the client dinners that turned into deals which kept their bonuses intact. Nothing about the $11.8 million portfolio I'd built from scratch. Just a signature line at the bottom of a page and a silent expectation that I'd quietly disappear. I remember walking back to my office, not out of obligation, but to pack. 9 years condensed into a cardboard box, the framed photo of my wife at Lake Erie, a ceramic mug my son made in 4th grade, and a leather-bound folder where I kept every client's direct line, not out of malice, but out of habit. No one said anything. No one made eye contact. Valerie from finance passed by and asked, "Switching offices?" with a smile that vanished the moment she saw my expression. Even the elevator ride down felt like a ritual. I stood beside a marketing intern who hummed along to music in her earbuds, unaware that the man beside her had just become obsolete. Outside, the March wind cut sharper than usual, but I barely noticed. My car sat where I'd left it, second row from the front, a relic of trust they used to give me without question. As I slid into the driver's seat, I stared at my own reflection in the windshield, wondering when exactly I became expendable. My phone buzzed just as I pulled into my driveway. It was a text from a clientone of the biggest, confirming dinner plans for the end of the week. asking if I preferred the steakhouse downtown or the Italian place near the lake. He didn't know I'd been let go. None of them did. And in that silence, in that small moment of disconnect between what they believed and what had just happened, something shifted inside me. Not rage, not despair, something quieter. Clarity. That night, I didn't speak to anyone. Rebecca was still in North Carolina helping her sister recover from surgery, and the house, already too quiet since the kids moved out, now felt like a museum filled with memories I hadn't had time to appreciate. I set the cardboard box down on the kitchen island, the one we picked out during our last renovation, back when we still believed that working hard guaranteed stability. I poured myself a drink, not out of habit but ritual, and stared out the window at the neighbor's porch light flickering across the street, as if unsure whether to stay on or go dark. There was no yelling, no shattered glass, no desperate phone calls to old colleagues begging for explanations or favors. I simply sat in the silence, and for the first time in a long while, I let myself feel the weight of everything I'd been carrying. 9 years of building something I thought was mine, of sacrificing weekends, family milestones, and even parts of my health burned away in a 30-minute meeting with 2 HR reps who didn't know my kids' names and a VP who thought charisma could replace competence. And yet, underneath the sorrow and the sting of betrayal, something sharper began to form, not bitterness, but precision. There was no panic in me, no flailing desire to prove them wrong with dramatic gestures or threats. What came instead was a kind of grounded clarity, the kind that settles in your bones after you've been through enough storms to know you don't need to scream to change the weather. I opened my laptop and pulled up the employment contract I'd signed years ago, back when Harlan Brayton was still a scrappy operation punching above its weight. The non-compete clause was there, just as I remembered, but limited, only enforceable if I'd resigned, not if they terminated me. And that word terminated now carved into that envelope on the kitchen table like a quiet blessing in disguise. They had released me, and in doing so, removed the only barrier keeping me from taking my relationships elsewhere. And I had many. My personal phone, separate from the company-issued device they deactivated before noon, still held over a decade's worth of trust contacts, texts, photos from client retreats, and family barbecues that had nothing to do with sales quotas. I scrolled through the names: Matt from Hawthorne Logistics, Janine at Clear Bay Mutual, the Sanderson brothers from Lennox Industrial. These weren't accounts. These were people who called me when their kids got into college, who invited me to their weddings and funerals, because I'd never treated their business like a transaction. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't send any emails, didn't post any cryptic status updates or rallying cries. I just sat with the knowledge of what I had built, quietly, steadily, without fanfare, and realized that no matter how hard they tried to cut me out of the picture, they'd forgotten one thing. I was the one holding the frame. At some point past midnight, I took the client folder from my box, the one I'd always kept separately, not out of malice, but muscle memory, and placed it beside my drink. My hands no longer trembled. The chemo had left me tired, yes, but not broken. And as I flipped through those names, I didn't think of revenge as some fiery mission. I thought of it the way a gardener thinks of spring's inevitable return, quiet, certain, and rooted in everything that had already been planted long ago. I turned off the lights and went upstairs without setting an alarm. For the first time in years, I wouldn't be catching a flight, drafting a sales forecast, or chasing quarterly goals by dawn. And somehow, that felt like the first real victory. By morning, the air felt different, not lighter, not brighter, but charged, like the sky before a storm that knows exactly where it's headed. I brewed a pot of coffee, stronger than usual, and took it out to the back porch where the frost still clung to the railings. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the neighborhood was quiet, save for the distant hum of early traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. I sat there for a while, thinking about what needed to be done, not in anger or haste, but in sequence. There would be no grand announcement, no public declaration, no digital fireworks, just 3 phone calls. I started with Travis Lynn, CEO of Brighton Metals, the kind of client whose loyalty wasn't transactional, but personal. We'd been through 3 acquisitions together, 2 contract rewrites, and more than one family emergency on both sides. He answered on the second ring. "Tom, everything all right? I wanted you to hear it from me directly," I said, steady as I could. "As of yesterday, I'm no longer with Harlan Brayton. There was a pause, heavy and real. What happened? I didn't elaborate. I didn't complain. Brian Kessler might be in touch soon. Or someone named Melissa Cranethave said she'll be handling your account. The new hire? From that group call? Another pause. She doesn't know our business. That's all I can tell you, I said, because it was the truth. The rest is your decision. He didn't respond immediately, but I could feel the calculation on his end, the sudden shift in gravity, the understanding that the trust we'd built wasn't transferable like a file folder. That call set the tone. I made two more, Janine Crowley from North River Logistics and Peter Simons at Civic West Holdings. Both reacted the same. Surprise first, then concern, followed by that quiet, unmistakable pivot, their minds already moving toward what this change would mean for them. I didn't pitch anything. I didn't need to. The seed was planted. By noon, my personal phone was buzzing more than it had in months. Word travels fast in tight industries, especially when relationships run deeper than contracts. Old colleagues, former vendors, even a few competitors I'd once sparred with at conferences were reaching out not to gossip, but to connect. Something had shifted, and the market could smell it. At 2 o'clock, I received a call from Michael Stanton, the managing partner at Westbridge Moore, a smaller firm with a sterling reputation and the kind of culture that still believed in handshakes and long-term thinking. I heard you might be in transition, he said carefully. We've admired your work for years, and some mutual friends speak very highly of you. I didn't interrupt. I wanted to hear the whole offer. We're prepared to bring you on as senior partner, he continued. Full autonomy, no red tape, a team of your choosing, and profit sharing on every book you build. We believe in equity here, not just earnings. It wasn't the kind of proposal you mull over for weeks, especially not when you've just been shown the door by people who measured loyalty in spreadsheets. I thanked him, asked for 24 hours, and hung up with the kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about moving on, it was about moving right. By the end of that week, Travis had called again not to ask for clarification, but to inform me that Brighton Metals was terminating their renewal with Harlan Brayton, citing a shift in relationship continuity. Janine followed 2 days later and Peter by the end of the week. All three contracts, totaling over $2.9 million in annual business, were now unmoored from the firm that had once relied on them to keep their quarterly reports afloat. I hadn't stolen them. I hadn't poached or persuaded. I had simply not disappeared, and that alone had been enough. And then, like dominoes lined up by fate itself, more clients began reaching out not because I asked them to, but because someone at Harlan Brayton was now trying to assign them new managers who didn't know their stories, didn't remember their kids' names, didn't understand that a business built on trust cannot be managed by algorithms and ambition alone. By Friday, my inbox was full, my phone never silent, and the whispers I'd once ignored were now echoing through boardrooms I no longer sat in. Back at Harlan, they were scrambling, offering discounts, promising seamless transitions, scrambling to keep what they hadn't truly valued, but by then, it was too late. I was settling into my new office at Westbridge Moore, a modest but sunlit space overlooking the Ohio River, when my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in weeks: Julia Fallon, my former executive assistant. The number was unfamiliar, clearly personal, and the moment I answered, her voice came through in a whisper, as if she were speaking from behind closed doors. "You need to hear this," she said, and I didn't want to say anything until I was sure. I turned from the window and sat down slowly, sensing before she even continued that this wasn't about nostalgia or loyalty, it was about context, the missing piece that made everything make sense. It wasn't just Brian wanting to bring in his people, she explained, her voice taut with restraint. They've been planning to sell Harlan Brayton for months. The words didn't hit like a hammer. They landed quietly, with the weight of something I had suspected but hadn't yet dared to name. Julia continued, piecing together a story that had been unfolding in shadows while I was still clocking 60-hour weeks and chasing contracts I thought would secure our future. Veritas Capital, she said. They made an offer back in February, but it came with a condition. They wanted to streamline client ownership restructure the top accounts so they were tied to the company, not to individual executives. And just like that, it clicked: a sudden audit of my travel expenses, the reassignment of my assistant, The increasingly impersonal tone of internal memos, and the cold removal from client-facing responsibilities under the guise of modernizing strategy. They hadn't been pushing me out because I was underperforming or too slow to adapt. They were preparing to sever me from the relationships I had spent nearly a decade cultivating. Also, they could present a clean portfolio client names without faces, revenue without people. They had to get you out, Julia said quietly. They couldn't afford to let buyers see how much of the business depended on you. I didn't speak for a long time. The silence wasn't numbness, it was calculation. Because this wasn't just betrayal by one executive with a bruised ego. This was institutional, strategic, and disturbingly efficient. They even brought in someone from Veritas a few months back, she added, now with a tinge of disgust. A consultant, they said. His name was Thomas Grant. He sat in on several client calls, yours included, pretending to observe, when really, he was assessing which accounts could survive without you. I could feel the room shift, not physically, but in that intangible way when truth rearranges your memory of everything leading up to it. Every polite dismissal, every unexplained change, every smile masking silent replacement now made sense. I wasn't pushed aside because I'd failed them. I was removed because I succeeded too well. After we hung up, I didn't pace or curse or throw things. I just sat at my desk and looked at the framed photo of Rebecca and me taken during our trip to Glacier National Park back when I still believed loyalty meant something more than a line item on a quarterly report. Then I opened my laptop and began reaching out, not to lawyers, not to the press, but to the clients I trusted, the ones I knew had been quietly approached under false pretenses. The responses were swift and unsettlingly uniform. Yes, I remember Thomas. He asked a lot of questions. Now that you mention it, we were told he was advising Harlan on industry positioning. Something didn't sit right with me, but I didn't press. It became clear that at least 6 of my most significant accounts had been circled, evaluated, and subtly prepped for transition while I was still on payroll, still attending meetings, still trusting the people above me. By the end of the day, I had confirmation that every one of them had been contacted under the guise of strategic consulting. The game had been rigged long before the meeting in that glass-walled room. I wasn't just a casualty of cost-cutting, I was a deliberate sacrifice in a corporate handoff I never agreed to. And now, the plan was unraveling. Word had gotten out that I was with Westbridge. Clients were walking. Veritas, from what I was told, had gone silent. And Brian Kessler, the man they brought in to orchestrate it all, was suddenly very quiet in the press. That evening, I received a message from Everett Lang, the CEO of Harlan Brayton, who had once shaken my hand during my 10-year recognition dinner and told me I was the foundation of our client trust model. His email was brief. Can we talk privately? No attorneys, just us. I didn't reply, because by now, the truth wasn't just bitter, it was complete. They hadn't underestimated me. They had simply miscalculated how much I mattered. 3 weeks after the fallout, I stood in the boardroom at Westbridge and Orr, flanked by a new team that didn't just welcome my experience but actually leaned on it, with respect that didn't need to be spoken, to be felt. A single slide lit up the Monitor quarterly performance review showing $8.4 million in new business, nearly 70% of it from accounts that had once been tethered to Harlan Brayton. No discounts, no chasing, just clients who knew where the value truly lived. Michael Stanton, the managing partner who'd first reached out, raised a glass of dark amber bourbon and offered a line that drew a murmur of laughter from the room. Best acquisition we've ever made, and we didn't even have to buy the company. I smiled, but I didn't join in. For me, this wasn't a celebration. It was something quieter, something deeper validation. Not the kind that needs applause or headlines, but the kind you feel in your chest when the world finally sees what you've always known to be true. That character doesn't get canceled, and value doesn't vanish just because someone younger, flashier, or more politically connected shows up. Later that day, while reviewing some onboarding materials for the 3 new account managers, I'd just approved to hire each one with the same revenue sharing model I'd negotiated for myself. I received an email. It was from Alicia Crane, the young woman who had once been positioned as my replacement. She'd been let go, along with most of the sales division. "Any chance Westbridge is hiring?" she wrote, followed by a note of humility that hadn't been there before. I didn't feel smug. I didn't need to. I forwarded her resume to HR with a single comment: worth interviewing. Not her fault what happened. Before heading home that evening, my assistant handed me an envelope hand-delivered, not emailed. Inside was a handwritten note from Everett Lang, Harlan, Brayton's CEO, the same man who hadn't looked up from his phone as I rode the elevator down with my career in a box. You were right. I put transactions above relationships. It cost us everything. If you're ever open to it, I'd appreciate the chance to say that to your face. Over coffee, I folded the note and placed it in my jacket pocket not out of sentiment, but because sometimes acknowledgement, though ever late, has its place. Maybe I'd meet him one day, maybe not. Forgiveness, I've come to learn, isn't always about letting someone else off the hook. Sometimes it's about freeing yourself from needing to see them dangle from it. That night, on my way home, I passed the building where Harlan, Brayton's name, had once stood, gleaming like a badge of honor on its mirrored facade. The signage was gone now, removed after their restructuring announcement. I didn't slow down. I didn't take a photo. I just kept driving forward, not backward, because the life I was building didn't need to carry the ghosts of a place that had never truly seen me. Exactly 1 year to the day after Brian Kessler slid those termination papers across that lacquered table, I signed the documents that made me an equity partner at Westbridge Moore. My portfolio had since grown to over $20 million in recurring business. The firm had expanded its footprint by 34%, with clients I had once brought in under a different banner, but who now understood exactly where loyalty belonged. Rebecca walked into my office holding 2 cups of coffee. We sat together as she asked me something simple. Do you feel like it's finally over? I looked at her, thought for a moment, and replied, it's not over. It's just right now. And right now, it's finally right. As she smiled and reached for my hand, my phone buzzed again. Another new referral, this time from a client I hadn't spoken to in years, but who had heard how I'd handled the storm. They weren't calling because I'd won. They were calling because I'd stood. And that, in the end, was the difference. If you've ever been underestimated, replaced, or quietly erased by people who thought they knew your worth better than you did know this, your story isn't over. Sometimes the best revenge isn't rage or retaliation. Sometimes it's rebuilding with grace, leading with strength, and being the kind of person they'll never be able to replace. Subscribe for more stories of real strength, quiet redemption, and the kind of justice that doesn't shout but echoes.